when we put the overall security challenges that transatlantic community has, what will you pinpoint like three biggest question marks that is around us?
Well, I think the first is Ukraine and what happens in Ukraine. That depends not only on Ukraine and on Russia, but also on the West, on the United States and Europe. But the disposition of that situation in Ukraine is going to have repercussions throughout the transatlantic relationship, but also in other parts of the world. So I would put that as number one. Number two, I would put on Europe. How sort of cohesive does Europe stay? It's been brought together in a lot of ways, certainly in defense and other ways from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it's not inevitable that it stays together. What do the politics of that look like? And then three, I've got to put the United States. I mean, who's the president next year? What's the policy? What's the policy toward NATO and allies in Europe? What's the policy toward Russia and aid to Ukraine? Trade, all of these kinds of things are sort of up for grabs.
And in all of that, we have our public opinions, where we have huge mistrusts, especially in traditional institutions, and above that, which we saw in World Economic Forum security risks assessments, disinformation and AI-generated disinformation as one of the key threats for our spaces. Do you think that we can expect of our citizens to be, let's say, cognitively resilient if we are not able to get all the things in one place and kind of articulate our democratic position towards misuse of information by autocracies?
Well, that's part of it. I don't think you can expect people to be cognitively resilient without trying to explain what's at issue here. The fact that there are hostile nation states that are developing disinformation on the back of AI applications and so forth and disseminating that. We saw this in 2016 in our own election, not AI, but through cyber means. But you also have the other flip side, which is that you don't want people to conclude they can believe nothing, right? And this goes hand in hand with this sort of decline in trust for institutions. So, at some point, you have to believe in some truth and in some authority to be able to convey things that are true. And if you can't, because no one believes in anything, then you don't get a shared picture of reality, which in turn is necessary for a functioning democracy. So these are huge, very difficult questions that are really brought forward by advances in technology that I think we're only starting to think about, but it really does cut to the core of our political life.
Do you think that Biden administration, with this concept of defending democracy, making this democracy alliance in the world, succeeded in putting this into like agenda for ordinary people in US or in other countries that were involved?
Not much for the average person in the United States. I mean, if you stop someone in the street and said, does President Biden, how does he sort of frame the world? I don't think the average person would say, oh, democracies versus autocracies. I don't think that resonates. Because I think, with the exception of Israel, Gaza, and Ukraine, there's very few foreign policy issues at all, really, that have resonated, and people have their own sort of domestic concerns and so forth. I will say the administration has defined the world as sort of this contest of democracies versus autocracies, but that tends to be more at sort of a conceptual and rhetorical level than in terms of policy itself. I mean, the United States has increasingly good relations with Saudi Arabia, which is not a democracy, right? Increasingly difficult relations sometimes with other democracies, right? So they have this kind of description of the world, but it doesn't necessarily bleed down into all the specific policies.
What's changed in the US with Trump's time and post 6th of January in terms of what we just talked about, in terms of what people call politics of lies, about what he's pursuing in his narratives? What's the main challenge within the US with this, what Trump is brought to the scene and is still bringing with him?
Well, part of it is this believe who you choose to believe business, right? So a majority of Republicans believe that Trump, not Biden, won the 2020 election. And Trump has said things like he won in a landslide, which is not true, and he did not, and Biden won. But if you believe that Trump won, then of course you're going to be outraged by what you believe to be an illegitimate president who's not fairly in the White House. That's not true, but that has real consequences for the ability to get things done within a political system. You have to see the legitimacy of people on the other side. And I think Trump, I mean, part of this is a social phenomenon, part is a technological phenomenon, but Trump has really kind of amplified a lot of this. And so this sort of, you know, crumbling, don't trust these people or these people, you can only trust what I say, has led people to believe what he says and other people to believe the opposite just because he said it. And that is, I mean, frankly, again, that's dangerous. You need two things for a functioning democracy. You need trust in each other and in institutions, some basic level of trust, and you need a shared picture of reality, and both of those things have been eroded.
In terms of you're a national security guy, expert, but in terms of internal security within the US, this kind of, you know, cracking of social fabric, what risks does it take with it?
Well, the risk of violence against elected officials and appointees. I mean, I've been in DC now for a long time, I guess, and it's new to have you know, members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, cabinet officers, doctors who are handling COVID have, you know, death threats against them, to have security details to protect them while they're trying to go about their daily lives, to have their families threatened. There has always been in the United States and in other places, you know, crazy actors who tried to assassinate some very high-profile political leader or some, you know, crazy person. But those have been the exceptions. And now one does hear that people internalize, well, if I take this position publicly, that's going to elicit the death threats, the hate mail, the threats of violence, the, you know, exposing what my family is doing, things like that. And it's hard to make policy based on what you think is best when you have to take into consideration, you know, there's going to potentially be some mob, online or offline, that is going to not accept what you said and try to make you pay for it.
What can you do? What can we all do? Because in Europe, what they're doing media literacy, building critical thinking, but you see cracks. You see cracks, intergenerational cracks, you see cracks within the policy, and you see global crack as part of Putin's strategies also sowing the seed of this value wars.
Yeah, well, I think this is part of it, actually, is to see that our adversaries want to use this against us because it is damaging, right? And so, you know, it's like the first step is to understand what phenomenon you're dealing with. This is not just a benign way things are. It weakens us as a country. It weakens our cohesion. It makes it harder to come up with national solutions to big issues and big problems. And of course, that's why our foreign adversaries would like to throw gasoline on the fire and try to divide us further against ourselves. So that's part of it. I think there's a bunch of things probably that make sense here and there, media literacy and all these other things. But fundamentally, unless you change the political incentives, then you're not going to get much of a change from politicians who are going to respond to political incentives in order to be elected and to be reelected. And so you have to look at what are the political incentives now to, you know, tell the truth, to talk about how institutions can be trusted, to find more centrist positions for things, as opposed to the incentives to say, you know, the other side is a bunch of demons, I'm fighting for you, vote for me and donate here because I'm on the front line and only I hear you and you can't trust anybody else. Right now, the incentives are largely aligned with that latter category as opposed to the constructive, what have I accomplished for you category. But that can be changed, at least theoretically.
Talking about practice, not theory, not to be Marxist, but you have insecurity, inequality, and this in the middle of it. So all the people that are like, you know, people on the streets that said they are pro-Trump, they always put inequality and insecurity as the reasons why Trump is the best. So what can we expect if Trump wins or if he doesn't?
Yeah, I mean, there's been already a huge literature to try to analyze where did this Trump phenomenon come from, why is he so popular, how come he can get away with things like January 6th or anything else and actually becomes more popular, not less, things like that. And so there's the inequality explanation, and there's the rural-urban explanation, and there's the education explanation, all these other things. I think part of it too is the feeling by a lot of people that the elites have gone and solved all the elite problems and have left behind or don't even think about everybody else. So, we have a global financial crisis, we have wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that don't go well, we've got all these we've got immigration, we've got all these illegal immigration, we have all these issues. No matter what happens, the elites seem like they do better and better and better. Every year, they're not losing their houses, their jobs aren't going away, they're doing better and better and better. But what about everybody else? And I think it's not so much that a guy like Donald Trump is solving those problems, but he's saying, I hear you. If you go back just to 2020, other than Joe Biden, the last two people on each side were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, who arguably had this same I hear you. There's this group of Americans, which is very large, that has been sort of this excluded middle that is not even heard. So forget having any status. I think part of the response is to hear these folks and try to fashion policies that are going to benefit as wide a group as possible. Kind of inclusive growth, not just overall growth that accrues to the top and things like that. All of those things are easier said than done. But again, I think if you can get sort of the diagnosis right, and the diagnosis is that even as our economy has continued to grow, unemployment is low, all kinds of good things are happening, you do have a large group of Americans that feels like they've been on essentially the short end of the stick when it comes to globalization and the other sort of global phenomena that has changed our society and our economy. And they want to know, does anybody even recognize that this is how it feels to us?
The big issue in 2016 elections was this Russia meddling, and it's been there in all the, from impeachment, Ukraine, and till today with all these processes against Trump. How, again, the word of the day, resilient U.S. is today, because I saw that Rubin is like taking a grip of this at certain point lost department in the state. Mm-hmm. So what can be done? What states are doing as a state concerning foreign influence in this information?
Yeah, I think we've learned some things along the way. So if you look at 2016 and the difference between 2016 and 2018 or 2020 or 2022 in terms of our elections, it was quite different. Part of that was probably that the Russians didn't try in those elections exactly the same things they tried in 2016, but also part of it was we had institutions that were more responsive to threats than they were in 2016. A lot of people in 2016 didn't quite see this coming, and so forth. But you add AI into all of this, and 2024 is our first sort of AI election. Maybe it will make a huge difference. Maybe it will make no difference. I don't think we know. But I also don't think that if it is about to make a big difference, we quite know how to handle it yet until we sort of run the experiment. As our institutions have and I think the society as a whole has gotten more resilient to the kind of stuff we saw in 2016, the kind of stuff that we might see in 2024, 2026 is unlike the kind of stuff that we saw in 2016. It's different. And I don't know how resilient we will be to that, because I think it's hard even to characterize what that would look like. One can imagine, okay, AI-generated automated bots at scale that have tailored disinformation and propaganda that so flood the zone, people don't know what to believe with. Well, yeah, I can imagine that, but we're not quite there yet. So if we get there, what do we do about it and things? That's the kind of conversations that are being had now, but other than it just being a big and potentially threatening phenomenon, I think we still have to sort of see how this goes.
And for the end in this, free market economy, social media companies, big tech has been, unleashed out in the world without anyone knowing the social consequences that their business model will have. Is the U.S. ready to kind of try to begin to work on regulating them concerning these impacts?
I don't know if it's ready to, just because we haven't seen much regulation so far. The regulation seems to blow across the Atlantic in this direction. So, the Europeans have been much more forward-leaning. I am not expert enough to know whether the European regulations are good or bad. The proposed regulations in the U.S. are good or bad. There seems to be overall a general sense in Washington and beyond that there needs to be some regulation, just no agreement on what that regulation should actually be. There also seems to be agreement that the U.S. should regulate or we're going to be sort of subject to European regulation. I guess that's a start, but that has so far not converted to a whole lot. And when I combine that situation with the overall sort of dysfunction in our Congress and things like that, if I had to bet on near-term regulation of particularly consequential ways, I wouldn't. So. And
just for the last point, something dropped into my mind. You said this functionality. You've mentioned how politics changed in the U.S. and globally. You worked, as I remember well, with Senator McCain when he was presidential candidate. You were his advisor for foreign policy, security policy.
I was with him for 5 years. Yeah.
My God. And when you look what he represented,
that was my experience too. My God, yeah.
Yeah, no. But what he represented within the Republican Party, and what we now have, and as Democrats and as Republicans, what has changed, and what do you think he would say to this, where we came from? The time he was there.
Well, I think we know what he would say because this change started to happen while he was still with us, and I remember these conversations and. He thought that a party that believed in U.S. global leadership, in strong alliances underwritten by the forward deployment of American troops, in an open international economic system underwritten by free trade, on a bias in favor of democracy and human rights as opposed to autocracy and the lack of human rights, that those were all not only the right things, but should be self-evidently the right things. And then the hard debates are, how do you do that? And what are the trade-offs? What are the costs and benefits? Who does, and all of that. But of course, we're now in a situation where a big chunk of the Republican Party thinks that alliances are bad, not good, on balance, thinks that free trade is bad, not good, thinks that the promotion of democracy and human rights is bad, not good, thinks that American global leadership is more costly than beneficial to Americans. And I think he would articulate the case for why those things are wrong and why sort of the party of Reagan and McCain had it right and still has it right. Now, I think there's some specific reasons why you have the sentiment that you have, and it is related to the wars that we've had and the global financial crisis and the real or perceived failures of some of these major kind of international projects in which the United States has been a leader. But that is, I think he would say, those are reasons to get it right next time, not to abandon the project of U.S. leadership in the world, because ultimately, U.S. activism in the world, U.S. leadership in the world produces benefits for Americans that are disproportionate, together with the disproportionate burdens that it places on us in terms of costs and activism. So I think that's what he would say. But that said, having worked for him for 5 years, I could never totally predict what he would say.
What do you think how will this end with Russia? How will this end? Because what we experience in Europe is already the huge wave of influence that is blowing from our south, from Africa, which is our immediate neighborhood, which is the youngest, most potent continent in the world, and has really immediate impact on us, you name it, from climate change to immigration. What you see as an end game for Russia and for this stalemate that we're in now?
Well, I think that where we are headed is to a new policy of containment. I mean, I was at the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago. A year ago at the Munich Security Conference, everyone was talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, a strategic defeat for Russia. There were even some Western Europeans were saying, hey, don't diminish Russia too much. They have to have a place in Europe. All of that is gone because of the situation on the ground in Russia and in Ukraine and so forth. That said, I think that you are hearing much more, for example, among Europeans, Putin needs to be stopped in Ukraine, not only because there's a rules-based international order and we don't want to encourage the next would-be aggressor to do bad things, but because if he's not stopped in Ukraine, he's going to move on someone else, right? And so it's containment. It's a geographic containment strategy, militarily speaking. I think there will need to be a containment strategy that goes after Russian influence, not only in Europe but around the world, where that influence is malign, where it tries to meddle in democracies and make them more dysfunctional than they would otherwise be, and therefore weaker countries. It has to be resisted, it has to be contained, it has to be exposed. You know, on the economic side, the same kind of thing. This is sort of, you know, using this part of policymakers' brains that goes back to the Cold War, and there's a lot of things that weren't right in the Cold War, but the idea of containing the expansion of Russian influence and you know, military expansion as well, ultimately I think it was right, and compared with the alternatives, I think that's the way to go.
Thank you so much, Richard, for this interview.
Yeah, thank you.